It's fair to say that while Lean was making films, people like Billy Wilder and William Wyler and Fred Zinnemann and countless other, really major directors absolutely venerate him and his work. And then you've got later admirers like Steven Spielberg, who credits Lean with essentially wanting to be a film director in the first place. But that's counterbalanced by a sense of critical trepidation around Lean's work. He's often accused of being a kind of cold craftsman. Even quite early on, back in the 40s, they're talking about somebody who has celluloid rather than blood running through his veins. And Rod Steiger, working with him later on Dr. Zhivago, said, "I wonder how much of that man is alive when he's not working." That's the kind of critique that's often been made of his cinema. But I think it's got a lot to do with when Lean is particularly enjoying that Oscar success around the big epic films of the late 50s and 1960s, Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia. So he's seen as a professional craftsman, filmmaker, making these big but slightly empty epics, as opposed to directors like Hitchcock, like Hawks, who are working within the studio system but are seen as transfiguring the projects that they direct into expressions of their own kind of artistic vision. But certainly I think Lean more than fits the criteria of having consistent motifs and thematic concerns across a range of different kinds of projects, right from his early career in Britain through to those more international epics. And I certainly don't find them to be cold or unfeeling pieces of cinema. Quite the opposite. They seem to be very heartfelt, very passionately conceived, both in terms of their visuals, but also in terms of the kind of big emotions that are being dealt with. And Summertime, it's a very significant film in his career and is his favourite amongst his own films. And I always think that's a very interesting choice because in some ways it's a film that isn't talked about as much as some of the other ones that he directed. And it falls between the big Oscar-winning epic that we get from Kwai onwards and smaller black and white British films. When it comes to Lean's career, he's all set for becoming an accountant. And he's absolutely miserable in it. He hates it. He's got no great facility with adding up numbers, but they set him up with this job in the city. And his aunt Edith says, when I see David's room, I don't see anything about accountancy, but I do see lots about films. So she's the one that suggests maybe this might be a better path for the young David Lean to take. And he manages to get a job set up at British Gaumont Studios, kind of very lowly, making the tea, being a runner, operating the clapperboard, working in the wardrobe. And he moves up into the cutting room. And that's really where his talent as a filmmaker initially flourishes. And he's very highly paid for this, and he works on prestige projects like Pygmalion and the 49th Parallel. And so when Noel Coward is looking for someone who's a kind of technician to collaborate with him in making the war film In Which We Serve, Lean's a kind of obvious choice for that. So that's how he gets his first co-directorial credit. When Lean's making Cine Guild films, the company that he made The Brief Encounter and Great Expectations in the 40s, he's viewed as a really important new filmmaker, Oscar-nominated, winning prizes at Cannes. And then there's a sense, particularly in the later Cine Guild films, that he loses his way. And one critic says, the Great White Hope has become the white elephant of British cinema, which seems a little unfair. And the negative criticism of his work clearly bothered him a great deal, to the extent that he could quote bad reviews of a film verbatim 30 years later. After the demise of Cine Guild. He's working for Alexander Korda's London films, so he's making The Sound Barrier and also Hobson's Choice. Very different films, you know, a Lancashire comedy and an aviation drama. I wonder if The Sound Barrier is partly the lead into that sense of wanting to explore bigger horizons. I mean, quite literally in The Sound Barrier, because it's all about skies and adventure and speed. And it leads us into some of the later films that he makes that have these kind of questing, obsessive male protagonists. But the stylistic variety of the films that he makes before Summertime sort of speak to someone who is being pitched into all kinds of different projects. And I think he makes an excellent job of them. But it's a very mixed picture as we move from the late 40s into the 1950s, and an uncertainty about where he's going to go next. He talks about feeling sort of exiled from England, of not wanting to have anything to do with the country. And I think that's part of a motivation for seeking out these different kind of projects. And Summertime helps galvanise his direction of travel in a way, that he never wanted to make another film in a studio. He wanted to make films on location because of the possibilities that they offered, and said that going back into a studio would be like going down a mine. You know, you kind of lock yourself away in the dark, and he wanted to be in the wide open spaces. And that's exactly what we see with the films that he makes afterwards. And that he wanted to make films that were more international in feel, that weren't necessarily parochial. But I think also there's consolidation of a shift in filmmaking practices around that time. So Hollywood runaway production, making films that are not made within the Hollywood studios but are made on location, particularly in Europe. We can see lots of examples of that from the sort of British adventure films like Knights of the Round Table and Ivanhoe. There's a desire with more use of colour and more use of widescreen to capture exotic spectacles from across the world. So the idea of making a film on location somewhere like Venice slots into that idea of how Hollywood is shifting in the 50s. By the time we get to Summertime, we've moved into different emotional territory, I think. In between comes things like The Passionate Friends and Madeline, two of the films that Lean made with his then wife, Anne Todd. So there's been other stories of fraught romances that have worked on a less suburban canvas than Brief Encounter. But I think it's also that shift into the international as well, that you've got a Hollywood star and you've got a globally famous location in using Venice. And everything just feels a little more open and free. So even though there's a lot in common between Laura in Brief Encounter and Jane in Summertime, you know, they're both very afraid of their feelings, very worried about what people will think of them. The furtiveness that we get in Brief Encounter is replaced by initial fear and then full throttle romance. El sole dell'amore. But also, it's not being filmed in a small English market town. It's being filmed in one of the most beautiful romantic places in the world. And the film really takes advantage of that. Summertime. It's an adaptation of a play by Arthur Lawrence, who would go on to write the books for Gypsy and West Side Story. A really interesting post-war American dramatist and writer. He wrote a play in the early 50s called The Time of the Cuckoo. In Lawrence's original, it's a much harsher story, which had Shirley Booth, who is very physically and also very different in demeanour from Katharine Hepburn, who already has such a well-crafted persona as the athletic, spinsterish but incredibly striking, impressive, quasi-feminist figure within Hollywood cinema. So there's a shift in emphasis between the original play and the film, and some of that is to do with what happens with the shift in casting. And it's interesting that in the first draft of the ending and in the original play, Renato is a much darker figure. He is immediately looking for his next conquest at the end of the story, whereas the parting of the couple in the version of the film that we have is much more imbued with romance and longing. There's that wonderful scene where he's bought her the white camellia and he gets to the platform too late to hand it to her, but unwraps it and holds it up. And that's such a beautiful ending that I can see it why they went away from the original concept of him being a much darker, sleazier figure in a way. Lean quoted with approval something that William Wyler said, which is that you can tell any story by means of a love story. And I think most of Lean's films work in a sense as love stories, perhaps sometimes quite obsessive love stories or malign love stories. I mean, we only need to look at Great Expectations and the kind of damaged characters who are driven by romantic obsessions of various kinds, right through to something like Lawrence of Arabia. While it's a fantastic piece of epic cinema, it's also a love story between Lawrence and Sharif Ali. There's a very strong suggestion of this homoerotic, close, loving friendship between the two men. So that romantic obsession, that's there throughout all the films.
I love you. Tomorrow? 8.
Alexander Korda's a massively important figure in British cinema generally, but I think also he's someone who's cosmopolitan and always has an eye on international reach and international markets. And you can definitely see the evidence of Alexander Korda's advice in the approach that Lean takes in Summertime. He's encouraging Lean, if you're making a film in Venice, don't be afraid of filming the obvious places. Don't film it all in some back alley canal. Film the big things, the picture postcard locations, and really go for it. Don't be afraid of the cliches. And that's also embedded in the ethos of the film. The character of Jane fears that she's a cliche. She's a middle-aged spinster who's looking for romance and has been picked up by a handsome roue who may or may not be married, may or may not be a gigolo. And she's faced with a choice about whether you resist it because it's inauthentic or whether you embrace it for the value of that experience, even though it may be questionable.
Why didn't you tell me you were married?
Oh, I see.
Why? Why?
I was afraid. I was afraid if you knew too soon, you would end us before we began. Now I'm afraid I was right.
It links to the whole thing about the red goblet that she buys, and she's persuaded to believe it's an antique and valuable. And later on, a sort of important, pivotal moment in her relationship, she realises that it's not an antique or it's mass-produced, but it's still beautiful.
There. Isn't that exquisite? Stunning. Oddly enough, I was looking for one just like it.
And that informs the way that, as she's advised, you're a hungry child, someone's offering you ravioli, but you say, no, I want the beefsteak. But finally, instead of holding out for the steak, she decides to eat the ravioli.
I want it to happen.
Don't you think I do?
Then?
It just isn't the way I thought it would be.
I'm sorry.
But I come from such a different world, and I'm not going to be here long.
So, it is better to take home only Venetian glass?
It's one of those moments where the film kind of shades into Italian cliches, but at the same time, it does encapsulate what Jane's choices are. And to have the romantic experience that she's been hoping for. And that is rendered in the most visually entrancing way, from the big night that they go out, and she gets herself made over into this very glamorous woman with a black dress and a red sash and red shoes. The red shoes are very symbolic and linked to the red goblet and other flashes of red in the film. And the moment where the affair is being consummated, we get this close-up on the red shoe that's been abandoned and red fireworks, which lots of filmmakers have used as a way of suggesting sexual ecstasy and fulfillment. Hitchcock had done it in To Catch a Thief. But it's not kind of sending that up in a way. It's using the cliche and inhabiting it completely and reveling in its beauty. You almost push through into something else, a sort of hyper-romanticism. And the way the film is made tries to convey that sense of sensual immersion in something so powerful in terms of colour and sound, and it gives you an eyeful. It's really presenting a beautiful spectacle.
If you don't take me, I'll never kiss you again.
Yes, you will.
Yes, I guess I will.
When Liam was asked what the film was about, he identified its main theme as loneliness, and talked about it as an emotion that, you know, is felt as often and as keenly as love, but is almost a shameful emotion to be in the grip of. And the film beautifully invokes that sense of being somewhere that's the most beautiful place in the world. And everything is in place for a romantic experience, and then you can't quite connect with that. You feel embarrassed about being a lone woman traveller of a certain age, and you worry about imposing yourself on other people.
Well, we're meeting some people.
I'll buy them a drink, too. Or are there too many of them?
Just another couple.
We're going on to dinner together.
Sure. Have fun.
Oh, Eddie.
This is where her film camera is such an important tool in the story. When she feels unsure of things, one of the things that she does to try and control that is to film it. And it's partly to do with preserving and capturing this wonderful place, but also it becomes a protective device. She's controlling what she's seeing. And there's a moment where she puts her camera down and she realises she's being watched, and it makes her very uncomfortable, and she puts her sunglasses on as, again, a protective device. So that idea of who's watching and who's being watched, and the gender politics of that. Also a connection to Lean's identification with Jane, because he was a very keen photographer, took lots of home movies on his travels, and clearly felt some of that same sense of, if I'm looking at something through a viewfinder, I'm controlling the way that I encounter the world. So I think it's a little sign that this is a protagonist that he identifies with very strongly. Jane. It's a character that's potentially full of pathos. There are moments where Katharine Hepburn really leans into that sense of pity and pathos, of the excruciating embarrassment that she feels in some of the situations she finds herself in. Probably the most famous moment from Summertime is the pratfall into the canal. There's that sense of someone's dignity being undermined. It seems to be much more of a personal journey. It's about someone questioning the values that they've lived by and have a magical experience of what she feels she's been missing in some way. And she really relishes it and gets the most from it and leaves Venice a wiser and more fulfilled woman. And she also knows that it's an experience that has a cut-off point. It's not that it has to be forever and ever, happily ever after, like a fairy tale, or nothing. It can be a transient but life-changing experience.
You know, all my life I've stayed at parties too long because I didn't know when to go. Now with you, I've grown up, I think I do know when to.
Summertime, clearly it was a film that Lean felt a very strong sense of identification with, and also the one that he put the most of himself into. Often when people talk about Lean identifying with his protagonists, again, it's usually in terms of T. Lawrence and being a desert-loving Englishman, having a kind of obsessive connection to the landscapes of the desert and the far horizon. So it's interesting to see Lean himself saying, no, actually the character I identify with most is a sort of lonely spinster from the Midwest who's trying to fulfill dreams that have not come to fruition in her life.